And thank you all so much for joining us this evening for our sample class on energy security and climate change. And so to begin, I would love to introduce our professor. Ambassador Rich Kauzlarich is a distinguished visiting professor at the Schar School. And as of January 2018, he is the interim director of the Peace Operations Program. And he teaches courses on the geopolitics of energy security, policy communication for executive leadership at the Schar School of Policy and Government. And since 2014, he has been the co-director of the Center for Energy Science and Policy, and he served as the deputy director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center at George Mason from 2011 to 2013. And I'm sure he's going to cover a lot of information today, and naturally you'll have a lot of great questions. And so at the very bottom of your screen, you'll have the ability to ask questions in the question and answer section. So feel free to just send any questions you have in there, and we'll be answering those questions throughout the time, as well as at the end of the presentation. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to our wonderful professor. Take it away.
Dylan, thanks very much. Paul, thank you as well. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. A lot going on in the world, but one of the areas where there is a lot going on in the world happens to be in the energy and climate change area. So I wouldn't be a professor if I didn't have my PowerPoint slides. So I hope that you'll be able to follow this along as we go through. And I do want to leave time at the end to for questions, and want to try to answer those as best I can. Just as I do in my class, I like to introduce me and what my biases are and what my expectations are in the classroom. So I thought that would be a good introduction for this evening as well, and then talk about disruptions as they relate to energy security and climate change this year. Talk about what I call marks of energy security and how those build to a broader concept of energy security. And then finally, since we are a policy school here at the Schar School, what kind of policy framework do we need to see, or should we see, in a new administration relating to energy and climate change? Dylan gave a bit of my background. I was 32 years in the Department of State, ending up my career as U.S. ambassador in Azerbaijan and in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I spent almost 8 years as a senior intelligence officer in the director of national intelligence, the National Intelligence Council. I've been at think tanks, both the U.S. Institute of Peace and Brookings. And here at Mason, I've taught courses in geopolitics of energy security, policy communication, and state and institution building. I've also lectured at the Foreign Service Institute, National Defense University. And the most challenging environment that I've been in is the Encore Learning Program for adults in Arlington County, where I've taught classes on the South Caucasus, Balkans, and energy security and U.S. foreign policy. So all of this together, I mean, it's important to understand because it shapes my approach, not only to the specific topic we're talking about tonight, but my approach to teaching in the classroom at Schar. I'm analytical. I'm a fact-based practitioner. I'm not I don't have a PhD, so I'm not, I'm not an academic. I don't take an academic view of things. I'm transdisciplinary because that's what I've been throughout my professional career. I see economics, society, politics, national security all interacting together. I make my students think in policy terms. When they write a paper, it's not just to write a paper, but to answer the question that the reader is going to ask. So what do you want me to do with this? And I also emphasize, particularly in the classroom when we're together, but I've tried to do this online as I've taught my class on energy security this fall. How can we learn from each other? look, we all approach issues, whether they're personal issues or public issues that we're engaged in our professional life with biases. I think it's important for you to understand what mine are as I approach this topic. As I said, I'm a practitioner. I'm not an energy expert. I mean, I've become knowledgeable about energy from my time in Azerbaijan and at the National Intelligence Council. But I come to appreciate how important it is to accomplish U.S. foreign policy objectives in a geopolitical setting. I believe strongly that markets and the private sector matter in all of this. I'm focused on China. I don't want us to forget about India, but when it comes to China and the Belt and Road Initiative, color me skeptical. Climate change is a big issue as well. I tend to look at it through the lens of who pays for the steps that we all must take individually, collectively, nationally, at the international level. Climate change, like anything else, is going to create winners and losers. And so I try to get my students to think about what are the consequences of a low and no carbon world. Who wins, who lose. And more fundamentally to this presentation tonight, that we really can't talk about climate change and a plan for climate change in isolation from having a plan for energy. Look, our US strategic interests, energy interests change. The Trump administration, what the future is now is a major wild card. All of our focus on the elections maybe has distracted people from the fact that the US formally withdrew from the Paris climate change mechanism today. So the question is, what happens after we're gone? I think too that constantly, keeping the focus on the changes that are going on, we do need to talk about new policy tools to address both energy transportation issues, but also the shift of attention from carbon-based energy to electrical power. Electricity matters, technology matters. And then finally, my overall bias in all this is that whatever path we take to a lower no carbon future, we're going to require hybrid energy systems, which will be part carbon-based, part renewables, and how we manage those is going to be a huge problem. So what do I mean when I talk about transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach? I love the website Farnham Street, which is run by a Canadian who had formerly been in their intelligence service, but writes a lot about management issues. How do you improve the functioning of systems? How do you develop mental models? And he quotes Charlie Munger, who is one of the gurus, if you will, of the business world. And Munger said, you have to realize the truth of biologist Julian Huxley's idea that life is just one damn relatedness after another. And so Munger's point is, we need models. We need to understand that things interact with each other in this broad system in which we as individuals and collectively function, and that there are effects that flow from the relatedness. And that's what I want you to have in mind as we talk about climate change and energy security. So this kind of shapes my expectations in the classroom. The teaching learning experience is centered on data and information, and my goodness, there's a lot out there in the energy world. So I hope my students know where they can find it. We try to learn from the knowledge and expertise of not only the people in the classroom, but I bring in outside speakers to talk about everything from the Arctic to technology. I try to apply my wisdom and experience, such as it is, to try to connect carefully the dots that are generated in the class. And above all, it's how do you approach the problem that we're dealing with of energy security and climate change in an action generating analytical framework. At the beginning of each class, I have students who come to me and say, hey, look, I really don't know much about energy and I'm a little nervous about being in the classroom with people who probably know more than I do. Well, my starting point is we need to understand ignorance, and ignorance is not a deviant form of behavior. It actually is the regular form, and how we deal with our ignorance is really important. And the other part is this second order thinking, this relatedness issue. You know, we need to think in terms of interactions of time and system dynamics. And all of this requires us to be active listeners, not just listening to what someone says to see whether it confirms or doesn't our own biases, but listening to what others say and trying to learn and change our biases as a result. So, good place to start is the disruptions in 2020. We really need to understand the world as it is if we want to explore the world as we want it to be, especially in energy and climate change. And the impact of the COVID pandemic on global trends has been profound, and it almost overwhelms everything else that I had traditionally done in the classroom when I taught this course on the geopolitics of energy security. And obviously it's affected the learning environment. We have to now deal, as we are this evening, online, which presents a whole set of problems and disruptions in how we present things. Well, biggest disruption, I notice this shows up as a red face for me on the screen, but we still don't know what the results of the election will be. But they have figured in our discussions in my class, because every week we try to talk about what's happened in the previous week that affects the price of oil. And the closer we get to the elections, the more attention that gets paid to it. But the real issue, the real disruptive issue is illustrated in this chart. This comes from the Eurasia Group, which is one of the best, I think, political risk analyst operations around. Ian Bremer heads Eurasia Group. It's also done in cooperation with AXA Insurance in Europe. But every year they look at the top 10 emerging risks based on their interviews with people who work in that risk environment. And number one, no surprise here, right? Pandemics and infectious diseases, followed by climate change, cyber risk, geopolitical instability. But the COVID thing has just jumped up to the top of everybody's attention, I guess, span, and to the extent that it drives other important issues further down the agenda. And that I think is a bit dangerous, particularly when we look at energy and energy security and climate change in this context. The International Energy Agency is one of the premier organizations in the world that deals with energy issues. And their reporting that they've been coming out with really from March on has had a focus on the coronavirus. And they've been very dramatic about stating that this is a once in a century event for its impact on energy demand. And here's a little chart that they recently produced that talks about the change in global energy demand from beginning of the 20th century to today. And we can see historically the blips, if you will, the jumps caused by cataclysmic events, whether it's the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, World War II, the first oil shock, which resulted in the creation of the IEA and OPEC, and then the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. But IEA is framing their analysis on energy that to expect that the COVID crisis shock to energy demand is the largest in 70 years, and that energy consumption declines will be 6%, which is 7 times greater than the 2009 financial crisis. And that makes it hard to pay attention to other things because this is so dramatic and had such a profound impact. So that any development related to COVID, vaccines, and round 2 new outbreaks, shutdowns, all of these things are, tend to attract the attention of people who should be looking at other factors in the energy and climate area. So again, back to Farnham Street, Shane Parrish, who's the head guy there, makes a point that we really learn not from paying attention to the latest news and the latest development, but learning from things that don't change. And he says that a lot of the information we look at, we probably seen it in the last 24, 48 hours in particular. Most of it doesn't stand the test of time. I mean, there's so much information coming in that we really can't absorb it, nor can we remember it. And we get so wrapped up in what he calls the mental sugar aspect of what appears in the social media world. And the people who are producing it, even though they may be good analysts in their own right, are following more what's liked and shared and retweeted and interpreting this as somehow ratifying their judgments when it might not stand the test of time. So let me start with what I think are the really critical pieces here of things that don't change. And whether we're talking about climate change or energy security, it really is about how we as individuals, want our energy. Well, we want it abundant. We want our car to start if we're driving our car these days, or the lights to be on now 24/7, given the way our work is changing. We want it to be reliable. I mean, when I flip the switch to the lights in this room, I really want it to be accessible when I want the lights on, not when somebody tells you the electricity is going to flow. And I've served in countries overseas where somebody tells you when you have electricity. We want it to be clean, clean in the sense of our immediate environment. That's why we worry about pollution coming out of coal-fired power plants, but we also worry about that same pollution and the impact it has on the climate. We want our energy to be affordable, and that's increasingly important as we think about issues of social justice, both in the United States, but in other countries as well. It does no good to have energy available if people can't access it. It's got to be resilient. It's got to survive disasters. The next hurricane, tropical storm that hits the Gulf of Mexico, everybody worries about, well, what's the impact on oil and gas production in the Gulf? What's the plan B? And then finally, we want our energy from diverse sources. We don't want to just be tied to a single source. And while it's a myth that the United States was dependent on Middle East oil, certainly that idea in the public mind was associated with needing to have diverse sources for oil. So let me just talk about 6 marks of energy security today and kind of the outlook. I always put little notes, reminders to myself in my presentations, and it is to ask myself, well, do these things change too? I mean, always have to be careful about what you use. I love this graph. This is the first mark because it can be used in my policy communications class as an example of the world's best PowerPoint slide. But it also says a lot about energy security, climate change, and geopolitics. Within that yellow shaded area of the world, there are more people living inside that area than out. And Statoil, now known as Equinor Energy Company, a Norwegian company, in one of its energy perspective reports, said if the world were a village of 100 people, 61 would be Asians. It just we really, we got to shake our U.S. focus and our Western developed country focus and understand that this is where a lot of things are happening, both for good and otherwise, in the area of energy security and climate change. I said, we really need to understand the world for what it is if we're going to understand what the world is as we would like it to be. So in the area of energy, it's really important to look at questions relating to climate change and energy from the point of view of, well, what are we consuming? What are we using? And here I think the real critical factor is, when we look at the elements, the primary energy sources in the world, we're talking about oil, gas, coal, nuclear energy, hydro, and renewables. As I quickly go through these slides, I really just, I'm really going to pay most attention to gas and coal. So kind of watch the red and the gray, both the graph here and then this time series. But it's from British Petroleum. They really do a terrific job in providing data every year. It's really important. And I think the fact that in 2019, so much of our energy was carbon-based, oil, gas, and coal. And while over time, we've seen the share of oil in this case declining and coal declining as well, it's been gas that's been rising, and most recently renewable energy has been rising. But the picture that we have today is a carbon-based picture, and you can like it or not, that's where our energy comes from. So what does this look like as we break it down? Again, remember the colors, that the gray and the red are the ones that I want to pay most attention to. Again, BP is looking at the regions of the world. And the critical element to recall is the importance of coal in particular in producing CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's really, really illustrative to understand where is most of the coal being consumed in the world. And like my first graph, it's in Asia and the Pacific, and basically in India and China. North America, that's mainly the US. Europe, surprise, surprise, a lot of coal there. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we want to be in a world, a low carbon, no carbon world. BP's report that was just issued on their energy outlook to 2040 says, if we want, this is what the world needs to, and they're going back to the turn of the 20th century as well, where almost 100% of the primary energy was in the form of coal. But 2050, if you want renewables to be above 40% of the share of primary energy, in order to achieve that, you basically have to have almost no coal, as well as drop-offs even in natural gas, oil as well. So this is where we want to be, but how do we get from point A to point B? Well, I think one of the ways we get there is to focus on gas. Gas is, I think for many people, a transition fuel between where we are and where we want to be. So that area of carbon-based energy is going to be very, very significant. And if we look at kind of the share of the global energy generation by fuel source. Now, this is different than what I started with by just overall share of energy consumption. This is the share of primary energy that's used to generate electricity. And we see that, this goes back to 1987 up to the present. Coal is still a very, very significant source of fuel for power. Gas has risen mainly because of the U.S. Hydro and nuclear have been relatively stable and declining, but the recent growth in renewables has been very significant. But it really hasn't had an impact that dramatic on electric power generation by coal. And again, if we look again at regional power generation by fuel, we can see that coal is mainly the source of energy for electrical power in Asia and the Pacific. North America, mainly the U.S. here, but Europe still is a source of demand for coal-fired electricity. Let me just quickly go through a couple of, three actually, country-specific breakdowns so that you can get a sense of how different or maybe how much the same the world looks. I mean, Germany's out there as the kind of model of renewable energy, and their green energy program has been very dramatic in terms of its scope. But when you break down, and this is 2018, break down their use of energy for power generation, renewables amounts to about 35%, most of that being onshore wind generation, not as much as I would have thought offshore. And not a whole lot of hydropower for obvious reasons. Nuclear is, for the moment at least, still in the picture, though technically the Germans have decided to phase out nuclear in the not too distant future. But look at this. Here you've got Germany relying for almost 35, a little over 35% of its power production from coal. Not so much from natural gas, but coal. And that's kind of the consequence of when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine in Germany, you need some sort of base power generation. And that is, in their case, the legacy systems beyond nuclear have been coal-fired power plants. So look at the same picture in the case of the US, and you see a little bit different. Renewable energy is only 11%. Most of that is wind as well, but interestingly, we've got a big chunk of biomass thrown in there. Nuclear energy, not so much. Coal, less than Germany, but considerably more natural gas. So different picture in the United States compared to Germany. What about India and China? And I just love this graph that I was able to find in a Congressional Research Service piece on Indian natural gas. Actually, the research for this came from one of my former students, so I'm very proud of it anyway. But India and China's primary energy consumption is between 60 and 65% from coal. Very, very little now this is 2015, so it's probably changed a bit, but very little from renewables. China has more hydropower than India, but here you have the biggest economies, two of the bigger economies in the world, reliant on coal to generate the electricity that's key to their economic growth. Last mark, several years ago, when BP did this report, and this is pre-COVID, when they did their report of looking ahead, they were shocked, I guess would be the best way to look at this, to say that the fuel shares in generating power, that is coal, oil and gas, and non-fossil, mainly renewables, nuclear, and hydro, have been consistent. The power sector absorbs more primary energy than any other sector of the economy. But since 1997, there really hasn't been any improvement in the mix of fuels feeding the power section, and that the share of coal in 2017 was the same as it was in 1998. Now, we would like the world to be in a different place, but we haven't been able to shake this this feature of our energy environment. So, what does this lead me to say? We really do need to look at a broader concept of energy security, one that is not only focused on sources of supply, whether we're talking about primary sources or electricity. We really need to look at energy security as kind of a set of concentric rings of priorities. There is the security of supply. There is security from climate change. We have to be concerned about that coal factor. There has to be concern about the environment, and there are obvious environmental issues relating to oil and gas development in the U.S. But have we thought about the environmental impact of renewable energy development? And I'm not talking about windmills killing birds. I'm talking about child labor in producing cobalt for batteries from the Democratic Republic of Congo, the pollution associated with rare earth refining in China. All of these things are important elements of energy security. There's the transportation element, but also for the countries that are producing the raw materials and the energy itself, they need security of demand. So when we think about energy security, we have to think in an integrated fashion about the relatedness, Charlie Munger's term, of all of these features. There is a set of national security challenges that relate to climate change. And my assumptions are climate change is real, but you can't simply address the national security challenges by addressing climate change in isolation. That the national security challenges are both foreign and domestic. It's not just something that happens in drought-stricken Africa. It happens at home with cyber attacks on our own electrical grid. And I believe that we collectively and at George Mason University are really teaching and learning about climate change incorrectly, in the sense that we are talking about climate change largely in a silo that doesn't touch on these other relatedness questions that I've been raising. National Intelligence Council produced a study back in 2016 on the national security threats from climate change. And it's kind of interesting to look at these in light of what's going on in the world today. First, extreme weather events and the impact that these have on defense infrastructure, thinking particularly of US defense bases, both overseas and in the US. The threat of climate change to creating conflicts over water and food, and I'll talk in a minute about one of those specific examples. The cyber risk to decentralized power grids as we become more of a electrical power system based on decentralized power producers, cyber threats rise. The costs associated with relocating bases due to rising sea levels around the world, and then the Arctic ice melt and the requirements that places on our defense budget to be more present in the high north. I would add two other things here, and that's the instability that is created by climate change in states that are small producers of oil and gas, but deprived of those earnings as we shift to a low carbon future. But also the instability in rentier states who are benefiting from the new minerals that are demanded for renewable energy. Congo being, Democratic Republic of Congo being a classic example of that. So I've added those sources of instability on this. a lot of talk, a lot of interest. All the students love the issue of um, the disappearing Arctic, because it raises so many questions about, what should the U.S. Have a greater icebreaker fleet than it does today? It only has 2 icebreakers, and the answer is yes. Should we be worried about China and Russia cooperating to dominate trade through the so-called Northeast Passage to Europe? I don't think so, but it's worth consideration. The Belt and Road Initiative of China fits into this as well, because a lot of the areas that, both on land and sea, that the Chinese effort to build their infrastructure presence in both coastal regions but inland regions have climate and national security. Oops, sorry, let me get back here. National security implications. Because the Chinese are building a lot of coal-fired power stations as part of their Belt and Road Initiative, particularly in South Asia. So looking at the National Intelligence Council assessment and sort of trying to backcast, what are the kinds of road, signs on the road to climate-induced instability, water disputes in particular, migration becoming a heightened source of social and political tensions, the adverse impacts on food prices and availability, increased risks to human health, and that really is brought into focus by the COVID pandemic, and then the negative impacts of a COVID-induced economic downturn on investments and economic competitiveness. If we had time, I'd go into geoengineering as part of that. And then finally, the stress on military operations and basing, particularly associated with the Arctic warming. Climate change and the risk of conflict really takes us to pivotal states, states that are of such an importance in a region that developments, climate-related developments, can have reverberations across a region. And this is from Peter Halden, who's written an interesting piece on the geopolitics of climate change, but he mentions Egypt in particular. And so, trying to plan for, develop a strategy for international stability in the face of climate change really requires mitigation measures. But mitigation measures that address security is kind of an indivisible, interrelated whole. Why is Egypt interesting in this respect? Well, right now, this is an area of concern because Ethiopia is building on the upper reaches of the Nile River system a hydroelectric project called the New Renaissance Dam. It's massive and has the potential for diverting water that is needed for urban and agricultural purposes in Sudan, and particularly in Egypt. And failure to resolve this conflict is an example of the kinds of social stresses, or social and economic stresses, that an energy project like this, with climate implications for Egypt that are profound, this is the kind of conflict that we really have to be concerned about, and we'll see how this all develops. And climate security issues related to global warming are hard to understand because they're these complex and regional factors, as well as the role of human activity. But it's clear that those who've been talking about climate change and the effects on infrastructure, both river as well as seaborne trade, are really seeing those effects becoming apparent now. So at the end, climate is a conditioning factor for these kinds of crises. It doesn't determine where the crises will take place, but it will show how conditions of international politics will be affected by changes in both the global and the regional climate. So climate change itself doesn't determine political actions, and itself is not a security threat, but it is integrated in a related factor to energy security, water security, and food security. Okay, getting close to the end here, but I thought it would be important, having taken us thus far, how this apparent odd couple of climate change and energy security became a couple in a policy sense. How we need to develop a framework, whoever the next administration is, for dealing with both energy and climate change. Part of this, relates to a vision for the future. I think most people would like to see, and this CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies think tank in downtown DC, laid this out a number of years ago as a vision for an energy future. A secure and low carbon energy system. It's going to take decades. This is a long-term project. It's not going to happen in the life of one American administration or even two. And it has to be based on policies that are both effective and politically feasible. And the political feasibility takes us back to the domestic aspect of energy security. It has to focus on how energy is produced, how it's delivered, how it's consumed without releasing harmful greenhouse gases, and at the same time looks at a diversity of energy sources and suppliers. Above all, we need to alleviate geopolitical tensions that in the past have been associated with competition for fossil fuel. Go back to the 70s and the first oil crisis during the Yom Kippur War. Geopolitical interests have been played out over access to supply of oil. What's changed is that the US now is self-sufficient in its own oil and gas production. Whether you like shale development or not, it has been the source of enough oil and gas not only to meet our domestic needs, but also to make the US an export power in the energy area. Is this positive or negative? One hopes that the future energy system will alleviate these tensions by reducing the dependency on fossil fuel. And then finally, the need to kind of integrate energy security and climate change priorities. There are countries who are going to be stranded in any transition to a low carbon future. I'm less concerned about Saudi Arabia because of its size, but smaller energy producers like Angola, Algeria, Azerbaijan are going to need help to transition to a low carbon future that doesn't undercut their economic growth that they've realized because they've been oil and gas producers. And then in all of this, the financing issue, which has become even more relevant today as the global economy is turned down. How are you going to come up with the funds necessary to deal with the public health challenges of COVID, stimulus for the economic recovery, and then financing of activities to relate to climate change? So what can be done? I think we really only have three choices. BP did us a favor a few years ago to kind of produce this chart on my left here that talks about carbon emissions and how you would reduce the contribution of carbon emissions from 2% to 0.5% from 2015 to 2035. And you really only have three choices. You can reduce economic growth. We've seen that. 2020 is a good example. You want to reduce carbon emissions, shut down the economy. That kind of does that. We can address the question of energy intensity. Are our buildings operating at their maximum efficiency in terms of energy use? Are the products we producing minimizing the energy content per unit of output? And then finally is the fuel mix. Do we use more renewable energy powered electricity generation over and above the traditional carbon-based? Do we find a different transportation fuel, whether it's hydrogen or electricity to replace oil? But those are really the only three, if you will, areas of policy action that we have to accomplish this objective. So, last point, Archimedes and his principle of, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I can move the world. And that's kind of the way it is in the climate and energy area. If give me enough time, give me enough money, and give me commercially viable technology, and I'll get to zero, a zero carbon world. But whether we're talking about small modular reactors or hydrogen or some sort of carbon capture and storage system and new battery development, all of this takes money and time. And where is that going to come to? So at the end of the day, this odd couple of energy security and climate change kind of revolves around this last point about how do we get from here to there? What are the policy instruments available? And how do we teach students to understand all of this relatedness in the course of one semester? Last slide, I lied, excuse me. Chinese have recently announced that they're going to become a no carbon economy by 2060, or net no carbon, when we put it that way. So remember that chart I had that showed the 60% or so of the Chinese economy that depends on coal. Here's what their plan, as articulated, would have to require. They'd have to, in order to get to the point that they say they want to be in their energy mix in 2060, they have to increase their solar investment by 500%, nuclear by 300%, wind by similar, and then cut back oil and gas and coal by levels that are just not imaginable. So you can talk about this, and the Chinese are trying to accomplish this in a way that doesn't require them to reduce their economic growth. It may have elements of energy intensity, but it's really focused entirely on changing the fuel mix in their economy. And as I said, I'm kind of a skeptic about China to begin with, and I just don't see how they get to this even by 2060. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was a really exciting a lecture overall. And so I'll start off a question as a public policy student myself. I know that policy changes is often a series of small steps, and climate science is obviously no stranger to making small steps towards larger progress. And so my, I guess, larger question is, with all these kind of options of where do we make our first step? And what do you think would be the most effective use of individuals' times, governments' times, as well as corporations' times to kind of prevent larger national security issues or international security issues?
Well, I mean, I think the first step is, how are you going to finance all of this? China, it's relatively easy because you have a centrally controlled economy and political system where decisions can be made with vast amounts of resource. I mean, China is a big country with lots of people and lots of money. So, that part of it, on the face of it, appears easy for China. In the U.S., well, who owns the technology? It's not the government, so we can affect that uh, by by funding basic research through this wonderful system of labs that we have. That's more of a longer term issue. But we are really going at some point, and I'm not sure politically how you accomplish this, but there's got to be kind of a meeting of the minds between people who are developing both climate and energy policy for the federal level of government and the energy sector, private sector, which holds the technology and actually does the practical development that lead to this low carbon future. I would add as a footnote, and this has come up in my class just recently. It's really important for people involved in policy formulation to explain the consequences of what they're doing to the American people. I think we think if we talk to each other, either as academics or policymakers, and we can understand that people are just automatically going to go along with this, but you really have to make the case and develop the public support for the kinds of changes, as you point out, some of which are going to be fairly substantial in the long run. Why the public should support that. I see one question. Maybe I'll jump that one if that's okay, from Michelle about SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And Paul, do you want to do it?
I think he was just marking the question as you're going to answer it live for you.
Okay. All right. No, that's really a great question. We've got, here at Mason, we really have a tremendous group of people who are looking at climate change, global issues. We now have an Institute for a Sustainable Earth, which I think is over time going to put Mason on the map in this climate area. But one of the things the Institute for a Sustainable Earth has looked at are these Sustainable Development Goals, something like 17 of them, if I recall correctly, that the United Nations developed over a period of almost a decade, that have been kind of accepted as the basis for moving to a low or no carbon economic future. They go from everything from clean water to reducing the urban pressure on consumption and development of resources, sea level rise, very, very complex. And one of them is, and I think it's Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is called Energy for All by 2050. And as I look at that list, I'm back to the interrelatedness period. I'm really struck by how do you get energy for all by a date certain. I can't remember now whether it's 2050 or a little earlier for the SDG process overall. How do you get energy for all without going through a period of carbon-based electrical power development in the short run? There really aren't alternatives. If we're looking at delivering energy for all in Africa, South Asia, coal is going to be a factor. I don't know how we get around it. And I can't claim to have a lot of experience. There's a whole mechanism, both governmental and non-governmental, of people who are working together around the world to try to accomplish these objectives in the US and elsewhere. But my my sense is we haven't really come to grips with some of the short-term consequences of accomplishing that goal in particular, with accomplishing the other goals that aim for, a low or no carbon future for the world. It's so I that's maybe an overly complicated answer to a pretty direct question, but I think it really requires looking at these SDGs in the framework of individual countries and regions of the world, and trying to make sure that when you're moving to accomplish those, that you're doing it in a way that doesn't also have unintended consequences for countries and people.
All right. Well, I do not see any additional questions. If y'all have any questions, please feel free to send them in. But I want to take a quick moment to thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I'm glad you were able to stay and watch this amazing lecture. And if you have any questions about the work we do, the research the Schar School conducts, and anything about our programs, please note that we are more than happy to answer any questions you might have. What I'll do is I'll leave our email in the chat line. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to send it to myself, and I'll make sure it gets to the right place, or I'll answer it myself. And please note, our professors are very excited about the material they teach, and they love expressing this material to their students simply because it is exciting for them as well as for the students themselves. But like I said, thank you all so much for attending this evening. If we don't have any questions, this will be the end of our presentation. I know it's around 6:30. It's about dinner time for a lot of folks. So please enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.